with me.
Excellent. Okay. So
I'll have to say hi before you take us on. Say hi, Saul.
Hello.
Hey, how are you doing?
All right.
Yeah, thank him for the beautiful graphics he did for our promotional stuff.
Consider yourself thanked. And hey, did you guys see that I suggested a couple of topics at the end of to continue?
Looks good. So I'm going to get started because now it's 11:15. I'm going to give it another minute or so. We can get all of our attendees in.
And a glass of cover your mouth.
So Jason, every time I cough, I have like a full-blown panic attack.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then I'm like, oh, forgot to take the Claritin today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good that we're having this highly transmissible pandemic in like one of the worst allergy seasons anyone remember.
Right.
Yeah,
I got swine flu added into it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can add in swine flu and H1N1 making a resurgence.
Ooh, good. A whole potpourri of viruses. Very excited.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to get started. This is Powering the Pandemic Pivot, and this is a Wednesday virtual lunch with the Entrepreneurs Advisory Team. I'm Alisa McCabe, and I'm the owner at First Steps Financial, and we help small businesses organize their financials, utilizing the latest technology, and specializing in QuickBooks Online and all the apps that go with it to make your life easier. We have Ayesha Hamilton. She's the owner at Hamilton Law, and she focuses on her practice on employees and employment law. And Jason Meyer, who's the owner at Meyer Business Law, and his firm is dedicated to the legal needs of entrepreneurs and businesses. We also want everybody to know that everything here is for informational purposes only and is not meant as advice in any matters, strictly our opinion. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll be checking with them. We're going to do a question and answer at the end. Also know that we have a slightly different format this time. We are actually going to do some current events. We're each going to have about 5 minutes and talk about the current events in our area. And then we're going to go into a discussion about our topic today. And we are going to talk about opening for real and what that means and what's happening for businesses, employees, and employers. And then we're going to take about 10 minutes at the end and take everybody's questions. And feel free to put everything in the chat and we'll get to it as soon as we can. So I think we are going to start with Ayesha. What's current with you? What's going on with employees and going back to work and all this craziness?
So, I mean, a lot of what we have to think about now is we quote unquote go back to work is, are we actually going to be going anywhere? And that's a shot called by the employer, right? For most of us, we have been working. So we've been working from home. We've been working at our dining tables. And so you're really going to have to start to pay attention to what your employer is asking you to do now and what your comfort zone is with that. But one of the things I do want to talk about, I'm going to be really, really quick and blow through this, but I want to talk about the recent Supreme Court case, Boston versus Clayton County, Georgia, Bostock. And it was decided June 15th. And I think probably knowing our composition of the Supreme Court, a fair number of us were quite surprised by the decision, and happily so. So now it is unequivocally clear that it is illegal in every state in this country to discriminate against someone who is gay or someone who is transgender who works for you. And that is now expressly and very clearly a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. I want to give you the fact patterns very, very quickly of what was involved in these cases. There were 3 instances that came up before the Supreme Court. Clayton County, Georgia fired Gerald Bostock soon after he started participating in a gay recreational softball league. He'd been with the county 10 years. stellar performer. Suddenly he's, playing gay softball, and that's not okay with the county. So they fired him for conduct unbecoming a county employee. Another gentleman, part of these lawsuits was Donald Zarda. He discloses to his employer he's a skydiving instructor, had taught for several seasons with this company, Altitude Express, and then he tells them he's gay and gets fired within a couple days. Okay. The last one is RGGR Harris Funeral Homes. They fired Amy Stevens, who had been working for them for 6 years, had presented as a male when hired, and then came to them after she'd had some really sort of severe psychological issues that related directly to her sort of suppressing her desire to present as a woman full time. So she comes to them after 6 years and says, I'm going to be moving forward presenting as a woman. And they said, well, not here, you're not. So the one theme that the court looked at in all of these cases is if Gerald Bostock had been a woman claiming to be attracted to men, he wouldn't have been fired. If Donald Zarda had been a woman claiming to be attracted to men, wouldn't have been fired. And if Amy Stevens had been a woman when hired, she wouldn't have been fired because she'd always be presenting as a woman. And so the court determined that sex was the determinative factor in their firing. So I won't go into the legal standards, but when you hear the fact patterns of these cases, you're like, man, that's crazy. Like, these were good employees. And so now you should know it is absolutely clear without a shadow of a doubt that these particular circumstances would be deemed to violate Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. All right, back to you, Alisa.
That's crazy that we even had to clarify that in this day and age. But
2020.
yeah, 2020. Well, thankfully, it has been cleared up.
Right.
In news in my area of the world, PPP loans closed today. Actually, yesterday was the last day, and they extended it overnight, which seems to be the way everything happens. I don't know what the Senate does. I don't think they sleep at night. I think they stay up and they say, what can we do to torture accountants? They extended it through August 8th. And so there is $130 billion left available for small businesses. So if anybody hasn't applied for the PPP loan and you've been on the fence about it, or you aren't sure how to do it, please absolutely go for it. I have a couple of cleaning companies that didn't apply for it, and they were just afraid. They didn't know what to do. They didn't think maybe they didn't qualify. Kabbage, Kabbage, Kabbage is still taking applications, and PayPal, they easily take applications online. So if you haven't done it, because this extension is really meant to hit those smaller businesses that are owned by minorities that may have not been captured in that first round. So please take advantage of this. Loan forgiveness has also been extended. Well, it hasn't been extended. Loan forgiveness by the banks. A lot of the banks are coming to customers who have PPP loans, who got them through them, and are telling them, hold off on applying for forgiveness. We are lacking direction from the SBA and the Treasury, and we are not taking applications. So just hold off on that. And we had a small discussion. I have fingers crossed that we're going to get blanket forgiveness for 80% of the loans because they were under 100,000. And Ayesha and I were just going back and forth about it. She's saying,
who knows?
Happen. I hope so, because it will save banks and the Small Business Administration a huge amount of manpower, and neither one of them have it to do it. So,
now,
and we'll save small businesses.
The extension of the PPP, that's last night was the Senate vote. So I guess we still need the House and the President to sign off on it. No indication that they won't, but I guess they still technically sign off. I mean, $130 billion is a pretty good chunk of change left in the
which is nice. And they're also saying that there may be some left over. Yeah, and they're going to figure out what they're going to do with that. But
unless that slows down the next relief bill.
So what's going on with you, Jason?
Yeah. So what stands out to me, our curves going like that, and that's what stands out to me in the news. Starting with the rebound of the pandemic, and just the blatant scientific fact that just as we in the Northeast here sort of brought this beast under some level of control, and you feel like you can go outside and not everybody you see. Literally everybody you see as a carrier, we're starting to put some, we've put the curve way down. Meanwhile, the rest of the country is just going nuts. The fact that stands out to me scientifically, and I don't want to go down the medical chain, but the fact that stands out to me, and we'll get back to how this affects your business later, is just, this is not like the diseases we know. Not just there's not a cure or a vaccine. The biggest difference is, according to Anthony Fauci, I'm not getting political here, up to 40% of the transmission is from people who are not sick, who never feel sick, who never show a symptom. And what's news about that to me for businesses is you can't just rely on, is somebody coughing? Do they have a fever? Oh, I trust my employees. Oh, I trust my customers. They could feel great and be a carrier. And 40% of the times people are getting sick, that's who they got sick from. So that to me is sort of the first headline in how we run our business, is that piece of medical news. That and the growth of the rebound, the second wave, if you will, of the virus, is having some business impacts. We've seen it in New Jersey, where the governor has said, hey, restaurants, I was about to let you reopen for business indoors. No, that's an indefinite hold. We can't be sure that we can keep indoors safe the way we can, or be as safe as we are outside, particularly because people have to take their masks off to eat and drink. So there's no indoor dining. The state has also officially quarantined visitors from 16 states, including Florida, Texas, the Carolinas, California. Like, a lot of people who come to New Jersey are supposed to show up at Newark and immediately to a room by themselves for 14 days, because we can't trust the level of transmission in other states. That's turnabout is fair play for what, like, Florida did to us when we had it bad. But this is an attempt to contain the infection. Now, is there a penalty for this? Yep, absolutely. Thousands of dollars in fines, disorderly person offenses. But how would you get caught? Here's what stands out to me about how you would get caught. This is the kind of instance where, to me, the way the state enforces it is it finds 2 or 3 or 4 places, maybe most likely businesses, that they can prosecute. And if they can make 2 or 3 big arrests, big prosecutions on things like you didn't quarantine, or you're not following the guidelines for your kind of business, that will cause compliance through the threat of enforcement. So they don't have to catch you, they just have to catch somebody, and maybe that will be you.
So make sure it's not you.
Make sure it's not you. The other headline I mentioned is another curve that's going like this, that if you looked at it compared to other years, you would think was COVID. It is COVID. It's the rate of bankruptcies. Bankruptcies right now are 3 times the rate that they were in 2019. Just in the last week, we've seen bankruptcies from companies like Aeromexico, Cirque du Soleil, the largest Wendy's and Pizza Hut franchisee in the US just declared bankruptcy. These are all restructuring. We can fire people, we can structure loans and come out the other side safely kinds of bankruptcies so far. We'll see more of that. The lesson here is be careful who owes you money and whether they are current, number 1. And number 2, this is a remedy. And oh, by the way, we're going to talk about this in greater detail, I think, in 3 webinars from now. But that's what stands out to me about the headlines, Lisa.
Okay, thank you. I have seen all that and concerned about all those things. Ayesha, okay, so some people are going back to work. What should they be thinking about as they return to work?
So great question. So as you go back to work, think about where you've been, right? Think about if you need to notify your employer that you've traveled to one of those prohibited 16 states. I would say even if you've traveled through one of those states, you now have this legal obligation to self-quarantine. But part of that begins with also you advising your employer that this is an issue. The other thing you should be thinking about is health and safety, right? So does going back into the workplace create a health and safety issue for you? Now, you cannot say, I won't come back to work because I'm scared I'll catch it. That's not the reason you can't go back. But you can say, listen, I have someone in my household who is in a high-risk category, or I myself am in a high-risk category. And so coming back to work with supporting medical documentation is going to create a hardship and a higher risk of me catching this thing. If you don't have any of those issues at play, right? And it's your employer saying, well, I'm requiring you to come into work. You may have a better argument now than you did pre-COVID for trying to work remotely, because you've been doing it for 13 or 14 weeks. So you might be able to say to your employer, well, can't I keep doing this? And won't that help you with your social distancing requirements in your workplace? So if we're all supposed to remain 6 feet apart and you want everybody to come back in, but we're all at desks that were very close together, how is that actually going to work? So some employers are taking the position of, well, you can come in on different days for certain hours. You come in Monday, Wednesday, other employees come in Tuesday, Thursday, and then Friday is an as-needed day. There's lots of creative solutions that employers are coming up with. And so it's then the assessment is yours to say, do I still feel that that's safe? Do I feel that the employer is complying with OSHA and CDC? If they are, then you really need to go back to work. Not going back to work because the enhanced unemployment pandemic assistance payment is still in effect, it's not a good reason, right? So you have to be cautious that if you say to your employer, I don't want to come back to work, they would be well within their rights to then deem you to have abandoned your job. And this is only if you have not given reasonable cause for not coming back. And then that makes you ineligible for unemployment compensation, right? So just be careful about, I say to clients who call me, is it that you're scared because we're all scared now? Or is there something specific that the employer is doing or not doing in the workplace that gives you some concern? If they don't have hand sanitizer, right? Jason, what do you think about from the employer side? What should they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, to me, from the employer side, the first thing is this really highlights the need to communicate. This is not a time to hide the ball. What makes people, one of the things that makes people anxious is not knowing. And there's a lot about this disease in the course of the pandemic, medically and economically, that we don't know. So what can we do to make these things known to reduce anxiety? Number one. And number two, to get, sort of more clinically legal about it. What can I do in my communication to make it clear to employees, if I need them back, that I have covered this and that genuinely I've made it as safe as they can, and they have to choose now between returning or not returning in terms of keeping or losing a job. So to me, that's things like, not just we're following guidelines, write stuff down. Have a plan and make it known to your employees and to your customers. This is what we do. Put up a sign, go on your computer, print it out, paste it up. This is what we do. And that's important to reassure your employees and your customers. And it's also important that you have some way you've got something to enforce with. You have something you can point to and say, I'm sorry, our policy is X, and it's written down. I didn't make it up. It's not arbitrary because I don't like your face when you walked in the door. This is what everybody sees. And of course, the third reason is if the person who walks in the door happens to be State Department of Labor or someone from the city's licensure bureau, I can show I am following the guidelines. I am not going to be the show prosecution in this town.
So Alyssa, I noticed that Lisa Snyder hit right on the question that I'm going to ask you. I mean, as you were talking about Cirque du Soleil, and give us a little brief example of that, but should businesses be also having the internal monologue of, should I even open?
Yeah.
Yes. And so that's something that you really have to weigh. Should I reopen? Some businesses, restaurants, can only open at a capacity for outside. Does that make sense? Can you bring in enough revenue to cover your expenses? There's also, if I don't open, do I leave the customer's mind and I just have to rebuild my customer base if I don't reopen? There's a lot of things to think about. And even if you are bringing people back into work that, you know, may have had to be home because their spouse was an essential worker and now they can come back to work, does it make sense? It's something to think about. Yeah, and someone said my gym and hair salon are never reopening. And I think that that is something that we have to think about. You know, does it make sense? I think these businesses are going to have to figure out a new way to provide the service that they do, because this is not going to be the last pandemic we see.
And if you are one of those people that's losing your hair salon, like me, and then you finally got sick of it and you said to your husband, hey, will you just like cut the bottom inch off my hair? If you're the husband, don't say oops. Just don't do it. the fear in my head, in my heart.
That's great, honey.
You know? No, don't say oops.
Well, and then the other thing too, for thinking about reopening, a lot of businesses have decided to stay remote, which it might be a really great decision for some businesses, but you also have to weigh in what are the costs and what are the benefits. You know, you may not have to pay rent anymore, which is fantastic. You've gotten out of your lease. You know, everybody's working from home, but then you have to think about security. And you have to think about what costs are associated with the security. So everybody gets a laptop. Are you buying them a laptop? Are they using their own, you know, their own resources? Are they using their own laptop, their own phone? And then how do you set up security on that so that they are only doing work when you need to? And that's something that you have to weigh in about opening. And actually, Jason was talking about it before. He said, yeah, you need to know what your numbers are to be able to weigh those things. So, and it's very true. If you don't know, you know, most of the time you know how much your rent is, but you know, there's other things that go along with it. Okay, so that amount of expense goes away. You really have to find a budget and find out how much do you have to keep your people working remotely safely. And also another very important thing about remote work is keeping your people connected. So how do you develop that culture now? And it's worth investing in if that's where you're going to go. If opening up remotely, that makes the most sense and you're going to do that and you're going to stay in this environment and it works for you, you also have to add in, how do we create a culture where everybody feels included, and that you can build bonds between other people, especially when you hire somebody new.
So Jason, here's my question to you.
Okay.
We've decided to open. Okay. What are the types of liabilities? What are the risks now that companies need to be prepared for in terms of exposure to customers, exposure to employees?
Yeah, let me count the ways. Yeah, to me, let me sort of drop back and tie that in for a minute, because to me, the thing about an entrepreneur operated business, the kinds of businesses we're all interested in, entrepreneurs have a different approach to risk than larger companies. There's some risks they absolutely cannot handle, especially cash flow risks. There are other risks like, betting on myself and my own ability that entrepreneurs will take all day. This is a time, I think, where you really have to think entrepreneurially about risk management and about balancing these liabilities and your concerns with defaulting on obligations or keeping the doors open with these liabilities and with the growth opportunities you might have. And it's two sides to the coin, and you just have to be coldly, I think, analytical about it. Great headline in the Atlantic this week: just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think the spike in recent cases is an example we can apply to how we run our businesses. The spike in recent cases was, oh, bars are open. I'm going to go to a bar. I'm going to take my mask off. I'm going to drink. I'm going to get close to people. You could, should you, right? So we could reopen. We could bring everybody back. There are a variety of things we could do, but should we? So let me be the downer, as Ayesha asked me to, and talk about, some of these lawsuit risks. There's the risk that your employees get sick, and they hit you for some OSHA workers' comp kind of claim based on the condition of the workplace. The workplace was not up to guidelines, for example, would be a pretty easy case, right? If you can't prove you are running your business in accordance with the state guidelines for your kind of business, you are wide open to the first sick employee coming in and saying it's because of you, and maybe trying to get workers' comp to help their medical coverage for the things that aren't covered. Contact tracing does exist. We're trying to trace how people get sick. That should be ramping up over time, not down. So if you have a customer and they get sick and there's evidence it came from you, there is an increasing chance that the government will figure out that it came from you, and that they will tell your customer that's where they got sick. How are you going to beat that lawsuit? The best way is that people don't get sick. The second way is to prove, well, it really shouldn't have happened here because I met all these standards. But the thing to remember about that kind of personal injury lawsuit is it's about negligence. Negligence is, did you exercise due care? Did you meet a sort of reasonable standard of care? And you got to feel like those state guidelines and the kinds of things you would see on every PSA and commercial are the basic level of due care you're owed. So if you can show these are the guidelines and this is my written policy, I exercise due care. If you got sick, hey, some people are getting sick and we don't know why. Sorry, but it's not my fault.
But also to add in there, Jason, it's important. You may have a written policy, and a written policy may perfectly comply with your guidelines. But if I walk into your store and nobody's wearing a mask, you can better believe that someone's going to end up with an OSHA complaint. And that is the last thing.
It'll be worse, right? Right. Yeah. That's worse, don't you think?
Yeah.
For in terms of employer liability and compliance, if you put up the policy and then don't follow it, you're really stuck your neck out.
So let me ask this question, and it's sort of to Jason and Alyssa, but Alyssa, you go first. You represent a lot of businesses, some small, some medium. Are you seeing that they are asking their employees to sign waivers before coming back into the workplace? And then the flip of that question to Jason after Alyssa answers is, do you think those waivers are enforceable? So Alyssa, you go first.
So I haven't seen it. It actually hasn't come up as an issue, which is interesting, and I'm surprised that it hasn't. It hasn't become mainstream, so I think it will be coming because the businesses have to try to protect themselves. But Jason, will it stand up?
Jason, what's the company argument?
Well, there's two company arguments. Whether we're talking about employees or we're talking about customers. One argument is, can it hurt? Yeah, maybe it'll work. I'll get somebody to sign it. Although I think it's kind of a crummy message to be sending your employees and your customers culture-wise. PS. Might it work? It might. And there's an argument that you get people to sign it because maybe it'll work, or maybe that will discourage someone from suing me. My own prediction for what little any prediction is worth these days, my own prediction is we are in the state of New Jersey and those things are not going to work. Maybe they'll work in a small number of cases, but New Jersey is a pro-consumer, pro-health, pro-individual state. And if there's any state in the country, maybe California would be harder, but otherwise.
What about clients? Like, could you, so, we have someone on here who owns a salon. She has a hair salon. And so could she have her client sign a waiver saying
I think you could. I think you could say to a client, you're coming here voluntarily. You are soliciting this service from me. You note that I would put in that waiver that I'm maintaining these safety measures in the space, that there will be, plexiglass separations, that I will wear face masks at all time. You're expected to wear face masks at all time, and you're assuming the risk of coming to this salon or to this doctor's office. I have a lot of medical practices that I represent, and they are having patients sign these waivers.
Really?
Doctors will make you sign waivers for everything, right?
Oh yeah.
You've hit Ayesha, I think, on a critical point about these waivers and how to make them hold up, which is, if the waiver is, we have absolutely no responsibility to do anything, your risk is totally on you, you had no choice but to walk in the door and sign this, that's the kind that gets thrown out. The kind that says, no, I accept some responsibility. If I don't meet that responsibility, yep, absolutely, I'm on the hook.
Right.
But what we're talking about here is a level of risk none of us can do anything to avoid. And the doctrine of assumption of risk is a real legal doctrine and is completely recognized by courts. And I think let's take the hairstyling as an example, right? There's some things it's like, we really ought to be able to do and be fairly safe about. There's some treatments you may come in and ask me for, it's got to be in your face. There's no way around it. So you, the customer, really should be making the choice whether you want to take that risk because you really need that treatment, or not. And that's the kind of place where a waiver is not only enforceable, but probably a really good way to communicate that someone has entered a different risk level and they have to assume it.
The distinction we would make is, if you're an employee and you need this job and you cannot not show up, right? There may be a different level of whether that waiver is enforceable. If the employer then turns around and says, well, I got you to sign the waiver, I don't really have to do anything now.
Right. And that's a doctrine.
CDC requirements will still trump your waiver.
Yeah.
Right. As will, and like your view on this, but in New Jersey, to me, generally, there's a doctrine which is, if the only consideration, to use the legal term, if the only way I am compensating you for agreeing to this is, well, you can continue to have this job you already had at the salary you already had, generally that agreement's not going to be stand up because they didn't give you anything extra for it. That's like the companies that come in one day and say, hey, everybody sign a non-compete. That's not going to hold up. So if you are in a situation where you've got to get your employees to agree to something new, you might want to think about giving them something new in exchange.
So I know neither one of you are insurance experts, but have you heard of Lisa Snyder posted the question, is there any new type of insurance that you've heard about for businesses being required to open? I haven't heard of anything. The only thing I've heard of is that the insurance companies are covering nothing. And that's insurance.
The insurance that you may not have had before that I think is worth thinking about having now is, if you want to go down the pathway to the business interruption insurance, that's one thing. But the other one I would say, look into, at least get a quote on and figure out what it covers, is your cybersecurity policy. Most of us don't have one. A lot of us now have one because you're really shifting to a remote, right? And that plays into, as you're thinking about, should I actually open, should I not open, it may be cheaper to go remote, but you're still going to spend some money on it. You're going to make sure that your document storage is safe. You got to think about insurance.
I think the other way it's critical to think about insurance is that you're staying on the right side of your insurance companies for the coverages you do have. Insurers will be looking even more aggressively for ways to deny paying big claims. And so if you are not meeting the requirements of your policy, this is another place. If you're not following the guidelines, maybe your insurer is the one who catches you at it and denies you coverage for something that should have been covered. Ayesha, it also occurs to me things like, businesses that sort of ride low on their workers' comp coverage. They're not quite buying enough workers' comp insurance, but you could really wind up with claims now, right?
Now, especially if you have a business where you're a contractor and you're, a plumber, you're sending people into other people's homes. We just had our air conditioning service, that kind of stuff. that's all covered by workers' comp, right? But now you're really putting your employees out into the world in risky situations within the scope of their job. Those are all covered instances. And so workers' comp lawyers are rightfully anticipating a big boom in business because there are going to be lots of people filing claims. And I got to be honest, you got to be careful here because the effects of COVID could be nothing or death, right? Like you've got to be really careful about making sure you have sufficient coverage. And I will say, my experience with insurance companies in the litigation context is the first thing they do is look for how to disclaim coverage, how to say, no, you didn't put us on notice, or you didn't buy the right kind of insurance, or you did not cover enough employees. You hired 6 new employees once you got that PPP loan, whatever it was, but they're not covered. You didn't then call us and adjust. Or you changed the way you were doing business and you didn't let us know. So Jason's point of let your insurance company know is really critical because that lack of notice is the biggest reason that they disclaim coverage.
I totally agree. And they're going to be very expensive claims. I mean, the reports on people who've gotten sick with COVID who are spending, a month in the ICU, who have lifelong health consequences. They're for real. They're not isolated cases. And those are whopper bills that an insurance company would like to turn down. Hey, can I add one more insurance tip that occurs to me? Particularly for businesses that have moved into the home, which is most of them. There is a kind of coverage that I have to say I stumbled into, which is, so here's the kind of risk it would cover, right? the FedEx guy comes to your door, or the Amazon guy comes to your door to make a delivery, and slips and falls. But the delivery was for the business, was for your business, not for you personally. Your homeowner's carrier could, in theory, decline that claim because it's not about the home, it's about the business.
That never occurred to me.
You could buy
right now, I wasn't sleeping before. Now I'm really not going to sleep.
Congratulations. There is a kind of insurance you can buy for this, and it's pretty cheap. And the place I have found that is from your homeowner's carrier. So to give you the example I know about for sure, State Farm has a policy that you can buy to cover this kind of incidental risk for at-home businesses. And I'm getting out of my depth. I'm not an underwriter, but basically, as I understand it, because they're already covering the risk of the home in large part, this additional risk of what might be attributable to the business is not a big risk for the insurance company to carry. And so the premiums are not very high on it. But it does cover you against things that might happen. So if you've taken your business and it's really home-based, you may want to ask your homeowner's carrier, how am I covered, and is there something cheap I can buy to help out?
So
That's
Alisa,
actually a really good point.
Yeah. So on that point, Alyssa, what are you anticipating seeing a lot more home office types of deductions? Because we're now all legitimately home office, and is it going to raise that red flag that it always used to raise with the IRS?
I am not a tax expert. We do not prepare income tax returns. We actually have someone who's an attendee who is a tax expert. And she actually brought up a good point. We were talking about expenses that people are going to incur for working remotely. And she said with the tax law section 139, that can pay for expenses for team members working remotely. So something to discuss with your tax preparer. And bringing that in might be a really good piece of information that maybe they're not thinking about. So it's something to think about. And I think there are going to be more people who are going to claim, working from home. I don't think it's going to raise a red flag. I don't think it's going to be an issue. There's just too many people working from home. And I mean, hopefully, the IRS will acknowledge that and not create it as a problem when people file their 2020 tax returns. And I think that I think it's going to happen for people who work for big companies. So what does that look like? And will things need to be changed on that end? Ayesha, you were talking about what happens if you go back to work what if you work for a company that has more than 500 employees? You know, I mean, what does that look like? Because I do have friends that work from home for companies that have more than 500 employees. So
I've actually encountered a few calls now where the employee works for big pharma, more than 500 employees,
Mhm.
and the divisions are taking decisions. Well, this is the day you'll come back in. And the employee says, well, I have a high risk individual in my house, or, you know, and the in your house part, they don't want to hear it. They're like, well, it's the policy. Well, what about the Families First Corona Act? Aren't I protected? No, that only applies to companies that have less than 500 employees. And that policy was designed
Wow.
with the thought that the companies with more than 500 employees would do the right thing. Well, I don't think we're seeing that play out, because for individuals that have worked from home for 14 weeks, for 13 weeks, are now being told, well, you need to come in because that's company policy. And by the way, we're not covered by the FMLA extension or the Families First Corona Act.
Wow.
So
Wow.
what's the recourse for an employee, Ayesha? Like what
You
do
you figure it out, you go in or you talk to HR and say, these are my medical reasons that I'm concerned, right? It's my 5-year-old son that has type 1 diabetes and I don't have childcare. And in the couple of instances where we came up against that, the company said, well, not having childcare is your problem, not ours. Right. And so, I mean, we're not even talking about school, right? Now we're talking about there's no daycare, there's no summer camp. And even if there were daycare, can you put are you comfortable putting your kid in daycare? Right. I mean, honestly, like I wasn't my kids were in daycare their whole lives, right? But I wasn't happy or thrilled with those snotty kids when you were, you know, in non-pandemic life. So if you work for a company with more than 500 employees, I think you really, really have to have a very detailed dialogue documented by emails that basically say, these are my reasons for not being able to come in. I have been working effectively from home for 14 weeks. I have not received negative performance reviews. Nobody has raised any concerns about my commitment to the job. Please let me continue to do that. The company might still say, no, this is our policy, we want you to come in. And then you've got to get some outside help.
And what I would say to employers like that is, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. You know, look,
that applies to small
are there companies that take advantage of these kinds of situations and don't have that kind of relationship with their employees? Absolutely. Do they succeed? Sure, many of them do. But to me, this is one of those times where the way you act in crisis determines what you really are about. And people will remember it. People still buy Tylenol instead of the generic acetaminophen because of what Johnson & Johnson did right to respond to a crisis decades ago, right? So people do remember. One of these days, you will be fishing for employees and do you want to be that company? Let's say, especially like big pharma in New Jersey, where there's competition for talent. You know, what side of that curve do you want to be on? And the compliance and ethics guy in me would say, maybe before you do that, open up that code of conduct, go to page 2, look at your company core values, and ask yourself, what actions are in keeping with our core values as a company? And by the way, when you do that, and then you decide to take a policy that's the right policy, tell people it's because of your core values, because that's what makes the core values really ring true. And that will ultimately make your compliance program successful, but because people see you put your actions where your words are.
And
I
this
think
is true
also,
for small businesses too.
Absolutely.
right. And you think
Absolutely
about the
required.
cost of turnover, right? So Alisa, you must talk to your clients about, okay, I mean, you take a hard line on this, but how are you
Yeah.
going to train somebody remotely when you hire them? They don't know
Well,
your company.
and that's the thing too. So that's another cost of, okay, so we're going to stay remote. We need to hire people. How do you train someone remotely? It's completely different than training someone in person. And you just do it differently.
Yeah, there's a way to do it. I do it all the time.
There is. I
help
do
you to do
too.
it. Absolutely.
But, and we actually hired during COVID. We actually hired a full-time person and we trained her remotely and it worked out great. And she actually said it was the best training she's ever had. And this is her first remote job. She's always had in-person training.
We're going to find a lot of people who've just decided, I work better at home. I'm happier at home. I'm more productive at home. This fits me better. It isn't for everybody. There's some people who really don't. But I'm reading blogs and stuff by people who are saying, I finally hit my stride as an employee. I feel like I'm finally doing the kind of job I want to do, working from home in the clothes I want to wear, in the desk where I want to be, at the times I want to do it. Now I'm doing my potential. And we should take that for real. Hey, let me ask one more question of you guys about reopening, and it has to do with testing. It's more available than it has been. It's still not universally available. We still have this issue with asymptomatic transfer. What are you seeing in terms of the use of testing as a solution, as part of the solution? Is it working?
So they're limited in what you're allowed to do, right? So you are allowed to take temperatures before you come into work. You're allowed to take temperatures through the day, right? You're reserved the right to say to an employee, look, it looks like you're coughing and hacking an awful lot. Maybe you want to go get tested. In terms of what you can ask them to do, you can only ask to have a COVID test. You cannot ask for an antibody test, because an antibody test is not giving you information about their current infection level. Now, you want to keep in mind that the COVID test is only good for the day and the particular moment in which they took the blood or did the nasal swab or whatever it is they're doing, because that person can go out and get infected, right? So you might really want to then be able to say, as part of your company policy, if you've been traveling in one of these prohibited states or outside of the country within the last 14 days, you need to let us know, right? So that's something I think that you have to be really proactive about. And Jason, as you had mentioned, you've got to do a lot of policy retraining. You can't just let people back into the workplace without, and I'm not talking about reviewing the sexual harassment policy. You're going to have to review and really train for the first time on mask wearing policy, on hand washing.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that we don't think we have to say in the workplace, you have to say now. And all of that is something that if you don't do, a plaintiff's lawyer like me is going to get all excited and say, because you just let them back in the workplace, you didn't have any signs up and you didn't tell them what the policy was. And
you have to think about things you've never really thought about before,
right.
like how are my employees going to eat?
Right.
Like, where does the food come from? Where can they eat? When they eat, they've got to take their mask off. How are they supposed to drink? Right? I can't tell them not to drink on the job, but I don't want them to take the masks off. So what are we going to do about that? And all these things, you got to think it through.
And they all have costs
have a plan.
associated with them.
You need to write it down in ways that you never really thought you needed to do before, right?
And it's something to think about in all these things that you have to do differently, and how are you going to do it? And do you hire someone? Do you hire a nurse to come in who specializes on how to wear a mask? And they have a new apparatus, equipment that you can put on doorways that take people's temperatures as they walk through the doorway and track it.
And by the way, I haven't personally looked into this, but one thing that occurs to me is that might be a place where you'd get some help from your insurance companies. I'm betting that there are insurers who have things up like guide to mask wearing and the like, because that's mitigating for them. And the one other point I would make about doing things like testing for temperature or waiting for someone to cough is, once again, remember, 40% of the transmissions are from people who never show a symptom. So taking someone's temperature does not make you safe. You have to assume everybody who walks through the door is Typhoid Mary. And if you treat your business like that, maybe we can all
You'll
get
be fine. There you go. So Renee, one of our attendees, she went into section 139, the tax code, that it's for things that are not covered by insurance, like daycare expenses and office supplies, and it's for the employee and the employer. It's tax deductible for the employer. So
and funeral expenses.
Funeral expenses, I know. I think we have to have Renee on to explain this, because
Yeah.
are things that, that we need to start thinking about, the expenses that we're going to have to start to really think about and decide, does it make sense to open? Does it make sense to have people work from home? And what are the costs for both? Because if you're going to have everybody come back in the office, are you going to bring in someone to have that mask fitting? Everybody has to learn how to do it. Are you going to, you have to have a whole new policy written. You have to put things in places. Are you going to have someone come in who's going to designate okay, so everybody over here, you have to walk this way. We put arrows on the floor. They're doing it in all the retail stores. Any retail stores that you go in, at least in Massachusetts, where I've been in some stores there's actually arrows on the floor that says, do not enter. And others say one way. So there's added.
And Alyssa, just a shout out to you. As we all started adjusting to this remote working environment, maybe about 6 or 8 months ago, you had said to me, listen, you got to try this program Asana, right? Let me tell you, the past 15 weeks, I have been up close and personal with Asana, and it has saved my life. So thinking about, I've got insurance covered, I'm gonna, get people to work remotely, but really spend some time thinking about how you're making sure the work's getting done.
That's that is actually one of the biggest hindrances for business owners when they want to have their employees work remotely. How do I know that they're working? And I think there is some old-fashioned thought to that, like, I want them checking in every hour, or every 15 minutes they have to hit a button that says that they're still on, instead of realizing that most people are grown-ups, and you provide them with tasks and you keep them in Asana and they check them off when they're complete. And then you need to have that second level of somebody who is a manager who's checking those tasks to make sure that they have been completed. And that requires slightly more training, an investment in something that can actually save you a huge amount of money in the future.
Hey, a couple thoughts. One is let everybody know in 2 weeks when we return, our theme will be cash flow, the way that our theme this time was on the realities of reopening. We're going to talk about cash flow next time. So maybe that is a time to have to focus a little bit on the tax side of this, because cash flow is two sides, what I bring in and what I spend. And if I can use the IRS to help me effectively spend less, cash is king. So we'll talk about that in 2 weeks, and maybe we'll get a little expert help for that. Alyssa, there's a question I wanted to pass along to you and see if you have a thought on that came in early on, which was about the use of PPP, it really factoring into your decision about whether to reopen and to what extent to reopen. So the situation is, let's create a situation hypothetically. Hypothetically, it's like, I am pretty close to the line. I need this PPP money just to keep the doors open. But of course, that means when I take it, I'm still going to be sort of close to the edge. Am I incurring any additional risk by taking that PPP money when I don't know whether we're going to make it, basically?
That's an excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
It is. It's a good, it's something very important to think about. Are you going to make it? And does this money make sense to take it? And I think it's time that some people take a hard look at their business and decide, do I really want to pull myself up my bootstraps? And you're going to have to dig in again. I actually have a client who feels like they have to recreate their client base because they've been closed for so long. So, and they actually haven't taken the PPP loan. And so to your point, I think you have to look at your numbers and you have to decide, am I going to make it? Even if, so, you know, what was 20%, 25% of your revenue before, if that's all you can open at? And what are my 25% of my costs associated with that? And what does that look like? And, you know, someone else actually asked on here about they've already taken the PPP loan and it's almost run out and they're still not open 100%. So what do you do?
I think that's most people have taken the PPP loan.
And so there, you can, at this moment,
especially because when we took it, or when you took it, I didn't take one, but when one took it, it looked like you had to spend the money.
Yeah.
Pretty much by now, right?
And so I think there is. So there's more things at play out there that are going to, I believe, come about that there's going to be a second round of PPP. There's no guarantee, but I do think it's going to happen for people in that case. Maybe what they use the extra money for.
Now, one thing in this regard that I haven't seen, but let me ask you, because I'm not entirely sure. I wouldn't say, hey, I absolutely would have seen it. So let me see if you guys have seen it either. I have not seen anything to suggest some heightened liability on the repayment of things like, you know, unforgiven PPP or above grant EIDL loans. What I mean, here's what I mean by this. With, let's say, federal student loans, right? We all know you're really at risk if you don't repay those, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. As a lawyer, if I failed to repay a federal student loan, I could lose my license, okay? I mean, it is, the government has super enforceability against me personally for that. Whereas PPP loans, EIDLs, if you do it right, it's taken out by your company, in the name of your company. What have you seen? Is there any kind of like heightened personal liability risk on these failure to repay these items the way there would be, let's say, for payroll?
I don't think there is. I mean, there's no personal guarantee either. And they're just in line behind all of your other creditors. And
there's definitely a lack of direction given by the SBA and the Treasury on all fronts. I even believe to lenders too. So it's a bit cloudy, and I think that there will be more information coming out as we know it happens overnight. So while you're sleeping, they're doing things, and I think we are going to find some more changes happen. If you have taken the PPP loan and you have completely exhausted it, there are grants available. I believe locally, there was just a grant that came out in Mercer County by the Chamber of Commerce, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is also making grants available.
Also look to your town. I know that Princeton Township has done something in terms of helping small businesses and small restaurant owners. So, you know, and the EDA has been trying to kick in. I know their money goes fast, but
there's some EDA programs that are still that I think are still available, especially the ones that are loan guarantee programs, like guaranteeing loans made to you by your current investors. I haven't heard that that's tapped out. You're right. There are a lot of options out there to help you out. And just look for what your level of personal guarantee or personal risk is. And this goes for all your contracts. Take a close look at whether you are personally on the line, whether someone's asking for a personal guarantee. If you're lending the money, you probably really want it. And if you're borrowing the money, you really don't. And it's going to come down to bargaining power, you know, who gets it. But that's going to determine in large part sort of, you know, where the money goes.
But also part of the analysis that I went through as a business owner is, do I actually want to take on
this indebtedness through either the EIDL or the PPP loans, and then worry about it not being forgiven, right? So if I can manage without it, I took the business decision to say I can manage without it, because I think I'm a negative person. Ultimately, I think that there's going to be hurdles and almost sort of form types of arguments that the banks or the federal government are going to put up to say, oh no, that one's not forgiven. Oh no, you didn't keep the right paperwork. Alyssa, you were giving us the example earlier of you didn't use the PPP loan for PPP purposes, you used the EIDL funds instead, and now you've got an issue of which went where.
Yep.
I didn't even want to get into it.
Mhm.
No, I know. And they're actually talking about how that's going to work. And the banks are actually sending out some specific information. The banks we've been dealing with, they send out specific information. This is what you're going to need. And then what happens is they send it to the SBA. The SBA has so long, actually the bank reviews it, make sure everything's there. And then the SBA has a certain amount of time to review it. That's also been called into question because it could be 6 months before you hear if your loan's even forgiven.
Right.
So there's so many things at play, and I think a lot of things are going to change, and they're going to change quickly within the next month. And then I'm hoping it will stick, because this has been the never-ending nightmare. So we have 1 minute left.
Mhm.
We will be back again in 2 weeks at this same time, and we're going to be talking about cash flow and how cash is king and how can we keep it coming? How can we keep it? And we may invite someone in to talk about some tax laws that we can take advantage of to maybe keep some more of that cash. All right. Thank you both so much. It's great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank everybody. And it's good seeing you all.
See you in 2 weeks.
Bye.